Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second part on drug policy and regulation for this week. So today we'll continue talking about drug regulations in the United States and in the recent history of the United States in particular. So the most obvious part of this is what regulations actually exist, and we'll certainly talk about that. Again, we'll look back as to the causes of these regulations. So last time we talked about how regulations started appearing in the early 20th century and why that was. It was because society was changing demographically. It was changing in terms of its access to pure forms of drugs. It was changing in non-drug related domains. But regulations in other domains gave rise to the idea of regulations in the domain of drugs. So again, we'll still be looking at causes for drug regulations. And more this time than last, we'll talk about enforcement, what the methods of enforcement are, how effective the enforcement is, and how enforcement has changed. So in particular, in this session, we'll look at the early regulation of controlled substances. And when I say early regulation, controlled substances weren't really a concept until 60 years ago. And even then they weren't legislated until the 70s. So the legislation of the 70s and 80s will take up a larger proportion of our time today. There was a lot of important legislation that happened in the early 70s and in the mid to late 80s that has really shaped how we think of drugs and drug use and drug regulation today. And a lot of this legislation was more specific. There are more drugs available today. And so the legislation that we'll talk about really dealt with drugs that were being developed, in addition to drugs that had existed for a while. So there were more drugs, and so these regulations got more specific in terms of their effects. And again, we'll look at the effects of enforcement, the pros, the cons of various enforcement methods. Okay, so last time we talked about a few important pieces of legislation in the early 20th century. So in 1906 and 1914, and in 1920, the beginning of Prohibition, that is the prohibition of alcohol with the 18th Amendment. So one of those was the 1914 Harrison Narcotics Act, which was really focused on non-medical use of drugs. And so this is looking particularly at opioids and cocaine, and these things were available as medicines through licensed doctors, but they were also being used recreationally and being abused. And so the focus here was really on the non-medical use. And it didn't control the so-called legitimate use of these drugs. That is, if a doctor wrote a prescription, that was fine. You could get a prescription for morphine, for heroin. And that was not regulated by this legislation. This legislation really sought to address economic issues. So the Department of the Treasury developed a narcotics division that was really designed to root out smugglers and importers rather than deal with individual doctors and individual citizens. So the 1920s saw a change in this. And of course, can't really talk about the 20s and the attitude toward drugs and drug use in the 20s without talking about prohibition. As I mentioned last time, we're not going to spend as much time talking about alcohol prohibition this week because we have a whole section on alcohol coming up, and we'll cover it in depth then. But the idea here was that the alcohol prohibition, despite the fact that it didn't last all that long, did generate this new idea. And that idea was that now that alcohol was prohibited by law, that people who continued to manufacture, but even to use alcohol, were criminals. And this was a new idea. Before, it was just smugglers and distributors that were criminals, and the average citizen who was a user was perhaps ill-advised to use the drugs, but was not criminal, was not in violation of the law because the law didn't pertain to them. But now we're seeing a change. We see that by prohibiting alcohol, we now criminalize drug use. And so this carried over to other drugs. And also led to the arrest of physicians and pharmacists who were prescribing drugs without seeing the actual patient, if they were just doing it over the phone, or without a rigorous physical exam. And so now we're starting to see a crackdown on the individual and on individual practitioners. And again, individual drug users were also starting to be arrested once drug laws were developed that outlawed certain drugs. So heroin was eventually outlawed, and so that criminalized heroin use, for example. One other thing is that we see the penalties become stiffer over time. We'll see them relax in the 70s a little bit, but then they go right back to being fairly harsh. Um, so the Jones-Miller Act of the early 20s was one of the first pieces of legislation to really have harsh penalties and things like minimum sentences for drug distribution in particular. Okay, and then this leads to the Bureau of Narcotics, which is part of the Treasury Department, and we've seen the Treasury Department come up before in our discussion of drug regulation. The Treasury Department, of course, is largely concerned with revenue, and in this case, primarily tax revenue. So there's this new bureau under the command of Harry Anslinger, looking particularly happy in this photograph. And his number one priority, it seems, was leading a campaign against marijuana. And so this is the portion of our recent history that has had a huge effect on the U.S. perception of marijuana and regulation on marijuana. Uh, so a lot of his campaign, as earlier campaigns had as well, focused on the use of marijuana by um, low-income individuals, and particularly minorities. And a lot of this didn't really have much basis in truth, but again, it was used as a political tool to prohibit the use of marijuana in the U.S. And so a lot of our drug laws, but particularly our laws and attitudes about marijuana, come from Harry Anslinger. So in the mid-50s, so this is during Anslinger's reign over the Bureau of Narcotics, he was in charge of it for about 30 years, we have the Narcotic Drug Control Act. And like previous legislation, this imposed even stiffer penalties, up to and including the death penalty for distribution. And also included this idea of minimum sentencing. So some of these sentencing regulations denied the possibility of parole or probation. So it was often a life term for drug use and really for drug distribution. So again, we see an increase in the severity of the consequences of these drug-related behaviors. Then in the mid-60s, we have the Drug Abuse Control Amendments. And so what these were really a reaction to was changes in the patterns of drug use. So for a long time, the most popular ones by far were alcohol, but of course alcohol was no longer prohibited. Tobacco, never prohibited. But also things like opioids, morphine, opium, heroin, cocaine, also popular, and the exception of heroin, these are naturally occurring substances. Heroin is a derivative of morphine and not a very hard one to create. But what the 60s saw was a change in drug patterns because new drugs are being developed. You had things like amphetamines, which became synthesized in the mid-20th century and are becoming popular stimulants. You also had the hallucinogens, which again were developed in the 40s and the 50s. And there are a lot of different hallucinogens. Some are naturally occurring, some synthesized. But they were becoming more popular in the United States, and there weren't regulations in place to deal with them. And so the 1965 Drug Abuse Control Amendments added certain drugs to the list of substances that were regulated by law. Okay, and now the 70s roll around. So there's what's called the Comprehensive Drug Abuse Prevention and Control Act of 1970, which is a mouthful. But this was enacted by Richard Nixon, and it addressed the problems that were perceived with the existing laws. And of course, the existing laws had been developing for almost 70 years at that point. So one of the biggest problems was that enforcement and regulation was split across a bunch of different departments by this stage. So you had obviously agriculture, treasury, but also the Justice Department was involved. Um, we had the departments of health. And so the idea here was to try and consolidate some of this responsibility. And so this saw the creation of the Drug Enforcement Agency, or DEA. Uh, and so this was a new idea, trying to, instead of having every branch of uh, every department within the government responsible for a different aspect of drug-related behavior or drug-related uh, revenue, that there would be one agency that was in charge of enforcing these policies. One thing the Acts of 1970, the Act of 1970 also did was lessen penalties. It was perceived that the penalties had become too severe and weren't really motivated by science and by research on the effects of drugs themselves as by politics. We've already seen that social changes had a lot to do with which drugs are more heavily regulated than others. And so now the idea was that we should use scientific evidence, not to say that all drugs are fine, that no drugs are dangerous, but rather to say, well, we should go to actual research to see how effective drugs are, how dangerous they are, how do we weigh those risks and benefits. And this is something the FDA had been doing for a while, but now this legislation sought to do it in sort of a principled fashion across all drugs, and to have a consistent and principled set of rules. So the laws for specific drugs were reevaluated. So again, the penalties were thought to be a little harsh in many cases. As we'll see, they later get harsher again. But looking at specific drugs, and again, weighing the risks and the benefits, how dangerous they are, and what it's going to lead to is what we call drug schedules, and we'll get to that on the next slide. So we'll see after 1970 that the system sort of creeps to become more complex, and the penalties become harsher again. And we'll examine the causes for that here in a minute. So one of the biggest contributions of that legislation in 1970 was what are called drug schedules. So if you've heard of a Schedule III substance, for example. So these are controlled substances. So controlled substances was a new concept, especially scheduling them into different groups based on their usefulness and their risk. So for each of these, you can see this is a table from your book. These schedules are classifications of drugs, and the classification is based on the potential for abuse, how useful they are, and the risk of dependence. And so Schedule 1 are deemed to be the most dangerous and provide the least benefit. So they have a high potential for abuse, and there's no accepted medical treatment. Whereas Schedule 2, the only real difference is that there is some accepted medical treatment. Now what's interesting here is that, especially in our current society, you'll see that marijuana is listed on Schedule 1. But as we've already said, Schedule 1 indicates there's no acceptable medical use. Well, we already know that currently there are thought to be several acceptable medical uses for marijuana. And so some have proposed that maybe it's time to rethink marijuana's place in the drug schedule. But in the end, it's really about this risk-benefit analysis. So heroin has a very high potential for abuse, and there are other pain relievers that are as effective without having those risks. And so that's why heroin is on Schedule 1. Whereas, for example, cocaine is on Schedule 2. It's not even as highly scheduled, so to speak, as marijuana is, because cocaine, for a long time, has been used as a topical anesthetic, and it's an effective one. Again, marijuana's place is questionable on this list, but morphine and cocaine do both have high potentials for abuse. And so again, it's a way of categorizing drugs based on the evidence for their usefulness and their risk. Okay, and that brings us to the 80s, and in particular the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 1986 and 1988. And this was legislation enacted during the Reagan administration. And it was really a response to new patterns of drug use, but also to the rising importance of foreign entities in drug supply. So, for example, you had what's called the crack cocaine epidemic of the 80s. And so, what's interesting and a little unfortunate is that there were vast differences in the severity of penalties for the powdered version of cocaine versus what's called crack cocaine. Now, scientifically, this doesn't make much sense uh, because they're both cocaine. The chemicals are not different. The method of administration is usually a little bit different, uh, but again, the cocaine is cocaine. You can change the time course to a certain degree, uh, but the penalties for crack cocaine were well out of proportion to the effectiveness of a given dosage as compared to cocaine in powdered form. And it's thought this was, again, motivated by socioeconomic factors. Powdered cocaine tended to be used by more affluent portions of the population. Also, tended to be used by Caucasian individuals, whereas crack cocaine is more associated with lower income groups, and in particular with the African American community. And so this portion of the legislation has drawn a lot of criticism over the years because the penalties seem to be driven more by these social factors than anything to do with the actual effect of these drugs or their addiction potential. There was also the rise of what are called designer drugs. And designer drugs are drugs that are chemically related to a known, to an existing drug. They're slight chemical modifications. And the thing is that as soon as you modify it chemically, it's no longer that drug, right? You can change one atom on heroin, it's no longer heroin. So the thing is that drug regulations are assigned to specific drugs. Um, and so designer drugs were a way to sort of circumvent drug laws, to try and stay ahead of drug laws, by creating drugs for which there were no current regulations. And of course, the laws would eventually catch up. And pieces of legislation were initiated such that the drug control agencies could sort of put in emergency amendments to the controlled substances schedules, and then these could be evaluated later on. A lot of these anti-drug abuse acts were geared toward trafficking. So that is the movement of drugs from outside the U.S. into the U.S. And so what these acts have expanded the power of enforcement agencies to look at behaviors beyond actual drug use and distribution. So looking at things like uh, money withdrawal. So money laundering is an important component of any large uh, drug operations function. And so looking at financial transactions, looking at cargo inspections, for example, especially when it came to air freight. And so this was sort of looking at both regulations for drug users, looking to affect the demand for drugs, and also suppliers. So looking to affect how readily drugs were available in the U.S. One thing is that after 1970, after things got real simple and a little bit more lenient, in the 80s, the sentencing procedures became more complicated. There's a complex point system that structures how drug sentences are carried out and applied. And it's more complicated than we need to go into. But again, we see this sort of shrinkage of the complexity of drug laws. But now we have new drugs. We have this looming threat of drug trafficking. And so the procedures become more complicated, the penalties become more harsh. And so we'll see this sort of periodic contraction and expansion of penalties and regulations. Another important aspect of this legislation was that restrictions were placed on drug precursors. That is, chemicals that aren't drugs themselves, but are sort of the feedstock for creating controlled substances. And for example, things like pseudoephedrine, which is a component of cough medicine, over-the-counter cough medicine, became more regulated because that's used to create methamphetamine. So it's not that the precursors themselves were dangerous, but the substance they could be used to create was. Also, the Office of National Drug Control Policy was created to, again, create sort of a centralized authority that oversaw the various drug enforcement agencies. The DEA is one of them. But again, the idea that too many different agencies were involved and weren't really talking to one another. And so you have this National Drug Control Policy Office uh, that really dictates the focus of drug enforcement and drug regulation. And speaking of enforcement, we can now talk about how these things are enforced, how effective these various measures are. Um, so one thing that's very noticeable is that starting in around the mid-80s, there was a pretty sharp increase in the percentage of the population in the U.S. That were in prison for drug violations. In fact, I think 2007 was the all-time high for the percentage of the U.S. population that was in prison. And I believe it was around 0.5%, which doesn't sound like very much, but it's 1 in every 200 people being in prison. That's a significant portion of the population. That's gone down a little bit in recent years, but as you can see from this graph, it's nowhere near down to the level it was in even the mid-80s. And as we in Colorado well know, there are differences in terms of drug regulation and therefore enforcement between state and federal laws. And this is a common point of tension. One thing to note is that the schedules, the drug schedules, are pretty consistent between states and in accordance with federal law. There's some variation. Some states have more classifications, more schedules. Some have fewer. But they're really pretty consistent in terms of which drugs are in which schedule. What's very different, though, is the penalties that are assessed. So from one state to another, you can have a 1-year penalty for an offense and a 15-year penalty or minimum sentence for the same offense but in another state. And again, as we well know, something that's recently become notable is the difference in marijuana laws. So marijuana still illegal under federal statute, but actually legalized for recreational use in 2 states, to my knowledge right now. And medicinal marijuana is legal in other states as well. So we have a lot of variability with regard to marijuana in particular. Now, in terms of enforcement efforts, beyond just penalties and imprisonment, we have things like drug screening. So for approximately 50 years, we've had the ability to chemically analyze, usually urine, to look for metabolites of drugs, or look for drugs themselves that are excreted in their normal form. So there have been an increasing number of segments of the population that are subject to drug screening. One of the first segments of the population was government employees, especially those with what were deemed sensitive jobs where they were in contact with sensitive information, or in which they were responsible for the safety of other individuals. Then drug screening began to be applied for private individuals as well, especially people like pilots and conductors that are, train conductors that is, that are responsible for the safety of other individuals, but also as part of employment. So some of you may have undergone drug screening as part of initiating employment or as a regular part of employment at a particular company. And this is done for a number of reasons. One is to reduce liability. So for the company, it comes down to money. So the company doesn't want, especially those individuals that are, for example, driving vehicles, to be under the influence. They want to regularly test those individuals to make sure they're not using psychoactive drugs while they're on the job. One controversial issue is whether welfare recipients should be subject to drug screening, and that will actually be one of your discussion topics for this week. The other is whether students in public schools should be subject to drug screening. Is that allowed? So again, the idea uh, is to enforce laws, but also nominally it's to look out for the health and well-being of individuals. So, but it comes up against the idea of invasion of privacy. And again, there's no easy answer. How do we weigh those two alternatives? Do we meet somewhere in the middle? Also, in recent years, the military has taken on an increased role in drug enforcement. Especially, for example, with the Coast Guard in the Florida area, they're frequently involved in drug interdictions. So trying to stop the transport of drugs from South America, for example, into the southeastern United States. And so the military has become involved in drug enforcement, not just the DEA and other government agencies. And of course, a lot of these drugs, especially the opioids and cocaine, are coming from other countries. And so there are international efforts to try and stem the supply of drugs and the importation of drugs into the United States. So again, opium is derived from the opium poppy, and from opium we get things like morphine. From morphine we get heroin. So a lot of potential drugs of abuse come from areas like Central Asia, Southeast Asia, from opium fields. And so there are international efforts, so you have to cooperate with foreign governments to try and curtail the production of drugs from opium, also from cocaine. So here we see the coca leaves and the purified form of cocaine. And of course, this comes largely from South America. And so foreign governments often cooperate with the DEA. So we have U.S. enforcement agents working with other governments to try and stem the production of these controlled substances. And of course, we can also directly support the foreign governments with money, as well as sending agents overseas to help with enforcement efforts. So we can supply money into actual governments of foreign countries so that they can do their own drug enforcement. And of course, this becomes a potential issue when our desire to enforce drug policy in other countries is at odds with our support for that government in general, or is at odds with that government's policy with regard to things like economics or religious policies. So, for example, we were actually giving money to the Taliban just before the invasion of Afghanistan, because the Taliban were actually cracking down on opium poppy growers. So that's one of those interesting changes in our attitude toward a foreign government. Before we were cooperating, and then we immediately switched to being at war with this government. And this isn't just Afghanistan that we're talking about. There are a number of foreign governments that have been, for example, dictatorships that our foreign policy didn't necessarily align with, that our views on human rights didn't necessarily agree with, but we supplied aid to these governments and they would fight drug production. So it does put us often in sort of a tricky situation. One other note is that sometimes a foreign government, especially in the case of Afghanistan, a lot of their economy can derive from drug production. So they don't have very much incentive to crack down on drug production. So the support that we give to a government is often at odds with their own economic self-interest. And so how strictly we want to push that issue can vary over time. Another issue, of course, is how much it costs, not just in foreign aid, so to speak, but also in terms of the budget, just domestically, enforcing drug policies. So how much do we spend on drug enforcement? Well, it's billions of dollars. How effective is it? So that's a big question. Um, we've had the war on drugs for decades now, and we certainly haven't won it. It's not. It wouldn't be fair to say that it's been totally ineffective, but obviously it hasn't been totally successful either. We do actually manage to capture a large portion of the drugs that are brought into the country and that are made within the country, um, but we certainly don't get all of it. And this has again sort of a pro and a con to it. If we shrink the supply that's available of a drug, um, that it's going to increase the price. It's going to increase the risk of producing the drug. So that's going to deter a lot of people from trying it or from continuing to use it. So that's the pro. But the con is that for those that continue to use the drug, now you've created uh, a much higher price. And as we've already seen, those that are willing to break the law in certain ways are often willing to break it in others. And so you have this correlation between breaking certain classes of laws and breaking others. Uh, and so, for example, if you increase the penalties for a certain kind of drug and someone continues to use that drug, they may be more comfortable with breaking other laws, like burglary laws. Um, and so that's one of the questions: is what is the effect of interdicting these drug supplies? Sure, we're deterring people, but we may also be making those that are left more prone to criminal behavior. Open question. So again, effectiveness is costly in terms of money, uh, but it has had its successes. But again, we're not there yet. The war on drugs continues. Um, so whether we should devote more attention, more funding to these efforts, less, the same, who knows? Okay, so that will wrap up our lecture series on drug policy and regulation. So next time, we'll actually start looking at a particular class of drugs, and these are the stimulants, things like cocaine, amphetamine. So we're going to start from now on going sort of drug by drug in terms of the effects that they have. So we'll look at the history of stimulants, some of which occur naturally, so have a longer history. What do stimulants do? The name itself is sort of a giveaway, but more specifically, what are the physiological effects? What are the long-term effects? And how has our society responded to the use of stimulants? So that will all be covered next week, and I will see you then.